Everybody, I'm Ashley. I know I see so many familiar names, which is awesome. So yeah, I'm just gonna basically touch upon a few topics here today, and I'm totally open for discussions. You guys have any questions? You want to chime in anything? Please do so. So basically, we're going to start with like what requires permission, because oftentimes I get this a lot, where I know prop masters. I know you guys are running a mile a minute. I know there's no time for clearances. I totally get it. I'm not on set, so I don't always see the action. I'm very familiar with the process, but but oftentimes like things will end up on camera that we wouldn't always just recommend just using. So basically anything that is copyrighted, anything that has any decorative nature to it, anything distinctive, the more colorful, the more likely those items would require permission. A lot of times things that get overlooked are like stuffed animals. A generic teddy bear is probably fine. I mean, there's a million generic teddy bears on the market, so probably those are fine. But something like a Care Bears, which is more distinctive, would probably require permission. Toys can be copyrighted, maps, wallpaper, murals, statues. You guys know, like the majority of it. You guys are pros, so I don't really need to go through everything. But it's just super important that those kind of things that are decorative and distinctive are submitted. I recently had an issue, not an issue, it didn't turn into an issue, but I recently had a prop master who was like, we're going to camera with this tea set. And it had like decorative little flowers on it. And I was like, oh, can we just cover those up? And he was like, no problem. I didn't even notice it. So, there's just little things that kind of come up that, I get that you guys don't really have the eyes for necessarily and just aren't thinking in the clearance perspective. So, it's better to submit items to the clearance coordinator rather than just use them and have to deal with it later, which is not always a great outcome. So that's basically what requires permission. When we read the script and we send out our reports, I would say 90% of my job isn't even scripted. It's all those other elements that you bring into the mix. And so, that's why it's super important that, we're constantly in touch with each other and kind of, telling us what you're wanting to use and what you're not. And I know you guys all have a kit that you've probably had for many years while you've been on this job. And things sometimes do change and evolve. So it's always really important that whatever's in the kit, we recheck and we make sure that it's still clear. Technically, if you are using an item that was created for another movie, that movie probably owns the rights. Sometimes we'll let that stuff go. Sometimes, we may not, depending on the use. Anything you get from ISS or Hand Prop Room or those things are usually fine. They still sign off. Earl Hayes signs off. Those companies are really great with us. And so, it's just important that we know about all those elements that you guys plan on using. If you created it prior to this job, then that would be your ownership. And so then you could reuse them and sign a release for each production that you allow them to be used. I'm sure you all sign deal memos. Those deal memos, whatever you create during the production, are property of that production. So that's pretty common in this industry, but yeah. Okay, the next topic we're going to talk about is copyright versus trademark. I would say on a daily basis, I get the, oh, here's something that we're using in the manner intended, so we're okay to use it. That is true if it's a trademark. And this only applies for really feature films and streaming productions, not network television, because obviously network television doesn't want us to use any logos because of their commercial tie-ins. And that's starting to come across streaming too. I've worked on some Peacock shows where they don't want to show logos anymore either. So that's just something to keep in mind, whether you're working on a network show or a movie or a streaming show. But trademarks being used in the manner intended, that's your Coca-Cola, your laundry detergent, your iPhone, basically, those kind of items that you are using in the manner intended, you absolutely can, as long as you are not going to defame them. You can't throw an iPhone at somebody. You can't, say the Coke is terrible and is making me throw up, or, you know, something horrible like that. But as long as you're just, you know, it's just sitting in the on set, person's just holding it, that's absolutely fine. But trademarks differ from copyrights. Copyrights are the items that we do need to clear. A copyright infringement, just so you guys understand, if we use a copyright, let's say we use a, you know, Picasso without permission, the the claim can be up to $250,000. So we do really take those kind of things really seriously, so that we're not going to have an infringement on any kind of copyright. So we do want to clear the copyrighted materials. But anything that's decorative or distinctive, basically. Like, even just for instance, a cereal box. A cereal box is a trademark. But then you get into the Captain Crunch kind of characters, and that's a copyrighted character. We generally still let cereals go and let it sit on a table in the kitchen. You know, we wouldn't really argue that. Also, like Kentucky Fried Chicken, like I've done this on a bunch of movies where we'll let you use the red and striped bucket, but we won't use the Colonel because the Colonel could be a copyrighted character. Does that make sense? So there's like elements I do think clearances has evolved over the years where we're kind of more flexible and allowing a lot more. I've been doing this a really long time. So when I first started, we used to clear everything. Anything that a camera would see, we would clear it. And now we've really gotten to a really good place where we don't need to clear everything. And like we can use the magazine mastheads, like Time Magazine, and create our own. And New York Times, and create, so there's really a lot more flexibility, I think, in the clearance world than there used to be, for sure. And I think we're headed kind of in that same direction going forward now with, the fair use argument. I'm working on some fact-based movies, and you have more of a fair use argument. Same with like documentaries. They have more of a fair use argument in being able to use something. Of course, it depends on the company that you're working for and how risk tolerant they are, because fair use is only an argument you can make when you get a claim. So many of like the small little indie companies, they don't even want the claim, which is why they are so much more conservative than a big studio. The big studios, they can protect themselves. They have tons of lawyers who can write letters and saying, hey, this is fair use, blah, 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 and these are the right reasons why. Whereas a small little independent company doesn't really want to spend the money on a lawyer to have to defend themselves. And that kind of goes into what we're going to talk about next, is the disparity between the studios. When you're working on like, a big Sony movie, they're going to have a lot more leeway than when you're working probably with me on a little independent or mini major studio where, we tend to maybe clear a little bit more than other studios. I know Netflix came out and they let a lot more go than other studios. They welcome the claims, to be honest with you. Generally, like, even if I went to people, you had a real issue with people don't even own the photos on their covers. So we'd still have to go to Getty and license them, and it'd be more expensive than you actually creating your own. Yeah, I mean, you don't want to be too confusingly similar to a real issue. Because you went to them. It sounds like you went to them. Like, we don't go to them when we use the masthead, we just allow it. So we're all on the same page. That's only US law, so it doesn't apply to international productions. I mean, not international productions, international papers. So like the Financial News is a London paper. Like, we couldn't mock up that without permission. UK laws differ from US laws.
That's all confusing anyway.
I know. I just had a production that wanted a Japanese newspaper, so I'm deep into it with the Japanese company, but you can't mock up their paper without permission either. So the laws differ from country. And that's why sometimes, if you ask us a question, but it's an international, we may not know the answer because I'm more, I'm not a lawyer, but I do know US law. and
Yeah.
IP in US, but not necessarily in other countries. Yeah, during the killing, we definitely need to remove any logos from that
Okay.
hockey stick. Exactly. Going forward, you definitely have to make adjustments. And oftentimes, like with a TV show, you're doing 10 episodes, you kind of know the arc of the episodes of what's happening, and this is the bad guy. So you would kind of hopefully know that from the get-go to kind of, make sure that you're not showing those brands in any kind of defamatory manner. It is true, but they kind of have to have some idea. They may claim that they don't, but they do. Trust me. I mean, I mean, a network may have issues with showing Pink Berry, but if it was a movie,
Yeah. This is
so
probably okay then.
yeah.
I have to apologize to that writer.
No, it's all good. But that's why we're here, and that's what we're learning about.
Yeah.
If a character just wants to hold a Starbucks cup, they're just drinking Starbucks, I would totally let that go.
Like the show that I'm kind of helping someone with now, they wanted a Pez dispenser.
See, now that's a good one to talk about, because
I said the Pez is okay, but whatever that head is intellectual property.
Correct. That's absolutely correct. They have all these copyrighted characters as Pez dispensers, and that would be a problem. Correct.
Yeah.
The actual candy, the little pieces of candy are fine.
Yeah.
So there are a few designs that Pez actually owns. Like they have their own Pez designs that aren't like.
Would I need to get permission from them, or would?
Correct.
Yeah, so.
And they've been film friendly in the past. So, and that's the other thing I know, those of you who have worked with me, I have a list of film friendly companies that I know sign off for me easily. And, except if it's like a horror film and you're doing something horrible, they may not want to participate, but a nice rom-com, they're usually fine with. So, and I try to keep those lists, keep adding to it year after year so that I have a list to present to you guys. I don't know if others do that, but I definitely do that. I want to go back though and talk about the disparity between the studios, because I pretty much have worked for every studio. So I get the disparity, and I get how frustrating it could totally be as well. I'm right now on a Sony show, and I'm just the clearance coordinator. Sony's seeing it, and they let all the HomeSense artwork. You go to HomeSense, Marshalls. They let all that like mass-produced artwork go, and that's not something that I personally would let go. I would want to do some more research on it. There is mass-produced artwork out there, mass-produced items that we do let go, but I totally get how frustrating you may be on one project with one studio, and then you jump over to Universal, and Universal lets tattoos go, but they don't let they want you to alter all police logos. So I get that each studio has their own, and sometimes that can be frustrating. Like, I don't think Universal actually lets you mock up newspapers and magazines, but like Sony does and other studios do. So it really, I get that total disparity, and you just have to get from the get-go when you start on a project and find out what their guidelines are on clearances, so that you know up front what you need to submit and what you don't, basically. I mean, me personally, I like everything to be submitted. I keep status reports, airtables, and honestly, that helps me so much when I see the movie 9 months after you guys have wrapped up. So that's why it's super important to always submit items to the clearance coordinator. No, I think we're getting there, to be honest. I mean, all us clearance people know each other. We all talk, we all know each other. And oftentimes if I'm on like a studio project, I'll be like, oh, I wouldn't let that go, or I would let that go. You know what I mean? And so I do think eventually I think we're getting closer, to be honest with you. I really do. And I'm still learning. I'm still like in awe of some of these studios that let things go that I wouldn't. And so it's kind of giving me like, hey, maybe I can be a little bit more loose here. And so I'm working on that, obviously, but I also don't want to put my clients into a bad position either. So, And what I think is important from you guys in telling the clearance coordinator is how it's going to be used. Generally when it's a prop, it's being held by an actor, right? So that becomes more featured than if something's just in the deep background. So we tend to want to be, make sure that whatever's being held by the actors are, a mug that may have a design on it would be cleared. So, I hear you. I would love to have an across the board, like, hey, this is what you need to do. We're just not there yet. So I will tell you honestly, whatever I lose sleep over and that I get worried about, that never comes to fruition. It's usually something that like didn't even think would be an issue that comes out of the woodwork. But there are, I would say photographers are probably the most sue happy. They see album covers, those kind of things that photographers. I would say photographers are the number one sue happy people. I've been pretty lucky. I'm sure everybody has a story or two. I remember when I worked at Disney and there'd be a claim and all hell would break loose. It was not a good thing. So, all of us want to prevent that from happening. Not that I know of. A lot of times these claims that will come in, you don't hear about it because they often settle. Yeah, and that's when it's something like that, you don't know if that photographer was hired as a work for hire, which would mean that guests would own the rights
Yeah.
or not. So oftentimes it is better to cover yourself and go and get the photographer's permission because honestly, and if it's a high-end photographer, yeah, they have people out there looking for this stuff for sure. So a work for hire is like oftentimes you guys will hire vendors to create specific elements for the production, whether it's a model or, like a figurine or whatever. Anytime you hire a vendor, an outside vendor who's not a part of the production to create an element for that production, you will need a work for hire to be signed. That basically is saying that whatever they're creating for the production will be ultimately owned by the production and not the artist, rather than if you're just licensing something. If something exists prior to the job and you just want to use it in the production, you're just licensing it and they would just sign a standard release. And so when you are hiring somebody and you are providing them with your inspiration, like, oh, this is what we kind of like, and we want to, it's really important that you often give that inspiration to the clearance coordinator as well, because there's been claims on something that's just too confusingly similar. I think Batman was a big example of that, where I think I remember what it was in Batman, but there was like Gothic City looked like another courtyard area or something, and there was a big claim on that. So you have to be careful. You don't want something that you are going to create to be too confusingly similar. I mean, we're all familiar with the 12 Monkeys case with the chair that the production designer saw in a book and then told his guys to recreate it. Those kind of things is you also get hit on pretty badly is when they're based on something that still is unprotected. So you do have to be careful, and it is really important that you're really upfront about what you are creating it based upon. That's an interesting question. I don't know. I do know of a big, big, big claim that came, and I'm not going to discuss it. I'm not going to tell you who it is or what it is or anything. But that Master kept continuing to work on their productions. There was never a problem after that, so that I'm aware of. So Master is being led by a production executive, a producer, a director, and just says, "Don't worry about clearance. Let's just use it." That happens almost in every movie, where a director will say, "Hey, can you just grab me a book? I want her to be holding a book." The minute that happens, just let the clearance people know, because we have more time to clear it, rather than when we see the production, see the locked cut and then it's too late. So, it happens, I would say, on so many movies or projects where, you're being put in a position where you're asked to put something on screen that is not clear. Just let us know where that happens, because it happens very, very often. You know, it's funny now. I never really thought about mass produced items because, Picasso is mass produced, but Picasso is definitely protected by copyright. And so, but now, I have a production that wants to do a shower theme with bumblebees and like all these little bumblebee hanging things that you can buy at Michael's or Hobby Lobby. Those are all pretty much mass produced. And so we're letting more of that stuff go than we used to. Um, so it, I would encourage you to still submit items that you think are mass produced, just to make sure that it is something that they can allow. But I do think that that's where we're easing up a little bit on some of those like items. So another question that came about AI. That's a great question because that's somewhere we are going. We're headed towards it. But at this time, I don't have any clients that will allow any AI. And the main reason why you can't just go on a site and download an image is because you're agreeing to those terms and conditions. And the terms and conditions on the AI sites thus far are really, really bad. And there's not really any studio that is going to agree to those terms and conditions at this point. I think we will get there, obviously. Unfortunately, I think because it kind of takes all the creativity out of the production and our jobs a little bit, but we will get there. But at this point, AI is not an option. Even ChatGPT is AI, and we don't allow you to create, verbiage using ChatGPT even. So that's been coming up a lot lately, and it's just not something that we are ready to allow at this point. I mean, also just talking about the internet, like, I know there's lots of sites out there like ArtV and Public Domain Review. Again, once you download an image from those sites, you're agreeing to their terms and conditions. So again, they're not always film friendly to allow. Also, a lot of those sites are US based. And so a lot of things are public domain in the US, but not public domain, especially in France. France has very rigid laws. And so you really have to be careful and really talk to your clearance person, and hopefully they're aware of the rules and the laws, because, you can find that there's, like I just had a lawyer who told me Matisse is in the public domain. Well, I know for a fact Matisse is not in the public domain. So, you just have to make sure that you consult with either legal or your clearance coordinator to make sure that something that you want to download from a site is acceptable and not just download from any random site. The other thing that there's a big disparity on is fonts, because I know a lot of studios have licenses with monotype, and a lot of studios don't have monotype font allowance. So that's an area where we used to see a lot of claims on fonts. I haven't seen too many claims lately on fonts. But I know for like my productions, I'll allow fonts from Google, Microsoft, and Adobe. Some people will only allow like Adobe Originals to be used. So you just have to check with your, clearance person and make sure that the font you want to use is acceptable. I know like at Amazon, they allow fonts. You can buy a font from myfonts.com. So it just really, that is another area of disparity where different studios have different font allowances. So but that comes up on every production as well. So I would say 95% of my productions get iStock. iStock is far superior to the only other option that we have, which is Superstock, has a subscription, which is great for low budget films, because it's like, I think I just had a production sign up for it. For 1 month, it's $199. So, and iStock is getting super expensive. It's almost $2,000 for a 1 month subscription, but it is far superior. However, on iStock, you cannot use an image marked editorial. And the only reason that we can't use an image marked editorial is because the terms and conditions when you sign up for iStock prohibit that use. So many people don't even read the fine print. What I do allow is sometimes if you really want an editorial image on iStock, is we'll just purchase it on Getty. So there are times where we will allow it, but you have to spend more money and purchase it on Getty. So kind of a bummer, but it is because of the terms and conditions again. So It's not your job to necessarily review the terms and conditions, but that's somebody like a clearance coordinator should know what the terms and conditions are that you're agreeing to and make sure that they are acceptable. That would definitely be our job to make sure that what you're downloading and using is going to be acceptable to the production. I've had plenty of productions that use an iStock editorial image on camera. And, you know, I'll look out for it in the final cut, me personally. And if I really can't make it out, then we'll let it go. But, you know, to the extent possible, I would say try not to use the editorial marked images, especially for a featured use. Getty is great. However, I'll be honest with you, their prices are getting exorbitant. There's a lot of question about this editorial use, commercial use. I know a lot of people put a lot of effort into this distinction. There really isn't a whole lot of distinction. Just because it's marked editorial doesn't mean we can't use it. If you have a photo of Annie Lennox that you want to use on camera, you know, as just like the person loves Annie Lennox, we would let you use that photo of Annie Lennox and license it from Getty. I do know there's a lot of people out there and a lot of studios out there that will make you go and clear Annie Lennox as well. That's not necessary. In the old days, we used to clear everything. There's no right of publicity issue with using a famous person as set dressing on a wall. So generally, we don't need permission. Now, the one issue here is that we would probably want to omit that from appearing in any kind of marketing material. So if it's in a key scene, we do need to know about that up front. So that's something to just kind of think about as well. Officials, you can definitely use, like most of those, you know, publicity photos of presidents are in the public domain and you can get them off of the Library of Congress, and there's no right of publicity issue. I will say though that Trump and Obama were trying to enforce their rights on some cases. Like I do know that Michelle Obama wrote a book. I know the publisher will never give anybody permission to use that in a motion picture. So that's not, you know, so they do try to enforce their, to the extent possible under US law, they do try to enforce it. Not if it's a government issued photo. No, you don't need to worry about that. And like somebody just asked about band posters. So band posters, like if I usually recommend my productions go to Getty or even Alame. Alame is great and much cheaper than Getty, but Alame has a lot of imagery that we cannot license because they don't really own it. So that's why we're really specific on what you get from Alame. But a band poster, like Mick Rock was a huge rock and roll photographer, and I know he recently passed away, but his posters, you know, he would charge like $750 to use them, which isn't terrible, but we can go to Alame and buy a poster of buy an image of Mick Jagger and make our own poster for $175. So that's usually the options that I would give my productions on determining how they want to proceed with a band poster. But you don't need to clear every likeness of the band, but you do need to clear the photographer rights of a band poster. I would say this is a prop and the character is going to be holding it. Can we do that or not? You know what I mean? I would try to get the distinction because usually set dressing will say incidental use only, but props I would never say that because I know the character is going to be holding it, right? Because you know what's going to happen is you're going to use it in your featured manner and then they're going to say, we told you it's incidental and now this is more, you know what I mean? So I would definitely ask for that distinction to, you know, CYA. Anytime you're using an AI tool, we're not allowing it. So that would not be allowed on my productions, any kind of AI. Photoshop is still acceptable. We've been using Photoshop for years and years and years, and that's, you know, why I don't really know. I mean, maybe it's been a while since I've looked at some of these AI sites like Midjourney and seeing if their terms and conditions has changed at all. It's something that probably, you know, I should check in and kind of review. If there's other AI sites that you know, like that you can do this on in minutes, send it to your clearance people and say, hey, this is the company we want to use. Can you look at their terms and conditions and seeing if it's something acceptable? You know, because that's always good. Somebody said Photoshop has its own AI tools. And I know like Adobe has, I can't remember what their AI tool is. Thus far, we haven't been able to use it. So, but again, I think that it's worth, when you start a new production, looking into what AI that you might want to use and seeing if maybe a company will allow it, because I do think we're getting closer. So, and sometimes, you know, legal people will surprise me even and say, yeah, this is fine. So, you know, if terms and conditions are changing and evolving, it's worth a shot. No, I would call that a trade. Yeah, I would call that a trademark. Those could be copyrighted, to be honest with you. So I would, you know, there's puzzle companies that definitely sign off and very easy to get sign off. So I would definitely recommend a production to get permission for a puzzle. But like if you have Crayola crayons, I would let that go. Absolutely. Just kids are playing with it. Now the coloring book is protected by copyright. So you need to clear the coloring book, or you just print off iStock coloring pages, and that would be acceptable as well. I mean, it's not ending up on camera, right? So whatever you're creating, but it's still based on that AI. The actual AI is not ending up on camera, but what you
Correct.
create. Again, I think you got to submit all of it and see like how, if it's too confusingly similar. You know, that is an interesting question. And kind of something that you just have to get your eyes on. You know, oftentimes I'll do like a side by side comparison and being like, yeah, this looks entirely different and probably would be fine. The manner intended only applies to trademarks that you're, you know, using in the manner intended. A Coke can on the table, my Stanley Cup, I would totally let my Stanley Cup go. You know, something like that would be absolutely fine to use. You wouldn't have to Greek it per se. You know, sometimes Greeking is almost worse. Where, you know, if it's like I wouldn't, you know, take my Stanley and call it, you know, Amley or something like that. You know, I know Earl Hayes has some of those that kills me with the Campbells and the Rambles. Um, but you know, they've been using those for years, and thus far I haven't heard of any issues. So, but I would be very careful in Greeking, for sure. Sometimes it's just better to just remove logos altogether if they're doing something not good with them. You know, I had a production like knives. Knives are a really good one because if they're being used to kill people, that's not really what they're intended for. So we'll always ask that logos be removed from them. And we try not to use distinctive designs, something that, you know, they're couple. My rule of thumb is 3 or more companies have to make that same design. So that's just something to think about if you know you're using something not in a great way. We'll you know, we always want examples of 3 or more, basically. And that's, yes, that's where I would say it's something that's mass produced. If you can find 3 or more companies that make the exact same design, it's something that I would let go for sure. I would submit it to your clearance coordinator and say, we want to use this and this is how it's being used. And then have them do their research. Hopefully they're, you know, they're able to do that research for you and come back and say, yeah, this is mass produced and okay to use for sure. And product placement can be great. I have a production right now. They're saving so much money with product placement. So I think on a rom-com, it's awesome. I still like to paper any deals. I want to make sure that what we're getting is all clear and good to use. So I like to paper all the deals. I don't know if everybody does that. But there's also times where, you know, the use may not be great, and a product placement house may not really like the use. And oftentimes what happens is you'll send the script to be read, and I've had this happen so many times, and you're not even going for that product, but the company will say, we love this use and we'll give you this, but we noticed this is scripted and you can't do that. So I do think it's super important to figure out before you go for placement on certain things that you want to get permission. Do you know what I mean? So it doesn't cause problems on other items. Does that make sense? Alcohol is a funny one. Obviously, if you go for product placement on alcohol, it's the one thing that like they provide you with these guidelines. And the guidelines are pretty strict, to be honest with you. If you don't go for permission on alcohol, you probably have a little bit more leeway. Obviously don't ever want to show anybody drinking and driving. That's, not allowed. You don't want to show a minor holding any kind of real alcohol. That's something, that we generally don't allow either. If they're getting drunk, I mean, that's what alcohol makes happen. You know what I mean? It depends what they do after. If they get drunk and they go to kill somebody, that's a problem. But if they're getting drunk and they're just going home and going to bed, then, it just depends on the scene and what's happening. But once you go for that placement and they say no, then you absolutely can't use it in that scene. You know what I mean? So it's something to just, that's why I'm saying, like, think about it before you go for permission, because it could put you in a worse bind in a sense. That's a good question. Yes, if it's Google, Microsoft, or Adobe, I would let it go under whoever's name it is. But if you're purchasing a specific font on myfonts.com, I would ask that it be in the production's name. You guys generally don't get involved in this, but for opening and closing, we would want that to be in the production name as well, usually. iStock subscription should always be in the production name. It should never be in an individual's name. Or if you're purchasing an image on Shutterstock because you need it for something, those should always be in the production's name. Absolutely. I don't think you can protect a color. I know Coca-Cola, protects their glass bottle. That's a protectable design. I don't think colors are. So if you had a cola that was in that red, I probably would let it go. I wouldn't want the same font as the Coca-Cola font on it, but I don't know that I would worry about a color. But let's talk about a few things that are very protectable and should never be allowed or used without further permission or discussion. One is the Red Cross. The Red Cross is super litigious. They do let Johnson & Johnson use the Red Cross on their first aid kit, but I would never recommend you use it in any kind of production. You can make it pretty much the cross any other color, but not red. Okay, that's like a statute. Like it's like a serious crime, which is crazy. Olympic symbol, the circles. You don't ever want to use that without permission. And the Olympics, I don't know if any of you have ever gone for permission on the Olympics. It's not something I would ever recommend. It's one of the most tedious, difficult permissions to get, and they charge a substantial fee. So those two are definitely no-nos across the board in any production, is no Red Cross and no Olympic symbols. Other than that, I can't think of anything else. Oh, the only other one that I do know that's really difficult is Smokey the Bear. Even though it's a government entity, they are litigious with where their Smokey the Bear appears. The other government entity that is a little bit, I wouldn't say litigious, but they want you to come to them for permission is the United States Post Office. However, I will say lately, I've worked on a couple projects where there's been postmen in the movies, and we haven't used it without permission. And knock on wood, I haven't heard of anything. So because it is a government entity, we do tend to be a little bit more lax, but just something to think about. I just want to encourage you guys to submit if there's questions that you guys have about any productions. I recently did, just gonna toot my own little horn for a minute, is I recently did line up with a company that does do indie productions, and that I am now available for consulting on indie productions, and I charge a very minimal fee on those. So it's something to think about with your indie productions. If they need some clearance consulting, I am willing to just consult with you guys and let you know what you need to clear, what you don't clear, because I have had the tedious task of fixing the indie productions in post, and it's not always the easiest. And sometimes it costs them more money in the end, to be honest with you, with having to fix things. So. Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And you know what? This is another one where there is disparity. There's certain studios that want you to alter it, and there is actually no percentage that it needs to be changed. I've heard that for years and years and years, but that actually probably wouldn't be held up in a court of law. They just need to look sufficiently different. So there's some studios that want you to alter the logos of all police entities, and then there's certain studios that don't want you to alter them and use them exact. So there again, I know there is disparity. I always recommend indie productions to alter it in the event that you do deliver to a movie, to a studio that doesn't like to use real logos, you're covered. So if you're working on an indie, I would strongly urge you to alter any kind of police logos. But I know if you're working like with Netflix or Amazon or Apple, I think they allow the real logos to be shown. So again, that's another area where, we got to all get on the same page, but we're not there yet. Fleeting. So fleeting, where I always compare, like if you're driving down Sunset Boulevard and you see all the billboards and you're just driving, I would let it all go. If the camera's facing or their characters are stopping and having a conversation in front of any billboard, that should obviously be cleared. So just kind of in passing, it would be okay. I will say though that mural artists are also getting quite savvy. And so we're really kind of particular on mural artists to make sure that we do clear them, because I have seen claims over the years on murals. It was funny, real quick, I'll just tell this quick story that I had a production, they were filming something and they wanted me to take a look at the dailies just to make sure that something, I can't remember what it was that they were talking about. And so they sent me the dailies, I reviewed the dailies, and then I said, what about that statue? And they're like, what statue? Not one person on the production realized that there was literally a statue in the middle of where they were shooting. Luckily, I think the statue ended up being in the public domain and it was fine, or maybe I got permission. I don't know. But it's funny, like, I understand you guys don't have a clearance eye per se, and that's why it is super important for you guys to be as transparent as possible. And sometimes I'll say, send me scouting photos so that I can look at the locations to make sure that I'm reviewing and making sure that there's nothing that you guys aren't noticing, because I understand that's not your job to look at things from a clearance perspective. But so I always like to look at as much as possible, but I know it's not always easy to send us items, and you're not, there's not always somebody dedicated to kind of be my point person on a production, especially a low budget one. They're really not focused on that at all, but it is important because hopefully I can save you down the line from some issues that we might have in post. So transparency and communication, I would say, are the most important things to have with your clearance coordinator for sure. Unfortunately, the law is not on our side at all, even though we can't find them. Now, tagging, we generally will let go. Tagging is where like they're just using the black paint to write their name or to write a symbol, or, but murals and graffiti that is stylized, I would either ask to be covered up or we will try to clear them. Sometimes they'll have artists' signature, or you'll call the location and find out. That's the other thing. Like, you can sometimes be shooting at a location and not think that there are third-party rights that exist. Like a church, for instance, where they have stained glass, the stained glass artist could still, own the rights to that stained glass. So I always ask my productions, ask the question to the location. Do they own the rights? Was it a work for hire? What, do they have any information? What year was it created? The more information we are provided, the better assessment we can make. So that's always helpful. The more information, just, again, just be as transparent as possible so that we're aware of what the use is and how featured it will appear, so. Those are questions that we always want to know. I've never heard that. The NYPD of all the entities is the most film friendly, though. I just had a production. I'm working on a production. They're all the NYPD are bad. They're all bad. I submitted the script to them, and there's no way they read it. Like 2 days, they were like, "Here's the license." I was like, "Okay." So, but yeah, I mean, we would allow you to use the NYPD. In my productions, I would let you use it without going for permission. But because they were all bad, the production really wanted to get permission. And so I was like, okay. So we did, and we got it. And so you just, yeah, they're really film friendly though. The only issue is they want to be given a credit, and not everybody wants to give credits anymore. That's a big thing in this industry. I don't really understand the reasoning either, but I understand credits are so long nowadays, and so they don't want to make them longer. But studios are really stringent on giving credits to any companies nowadays. It's really something they really don't want to do. So that can't always be a good negotiating aspect to get somebody to sign off anymore. But sometimes indies will allow it. They'll say, "Oh yeah, we can save a little bit of money and just give them a credit." So that's usually a good thing. No, I would not say that you have to cover the branding. I mean, it's probably a safe bet, but he wasn't racist because he drove a Honda. Unless you said like, "Oh, only racist people drive Hondas." You know what I mean? Every production is different. Every production still brings up different things. Like I honestly, I've been doing this for a really long time, and I'm still learning sometimes on things. And that's I think what makes it kind of a fun experience. I think we also get the brunt of Ashley says no so much, and I'm really trying to learn not to say no and say, hey, instead of this, why don't you do this? That's kind of been my learning experience over the years, is like, okay, you may not be able to use it this way or do this, but how about this? And so I do try to give suggestions. I'm not trying to give a creative input per se, but I'm just trying to steer you into a different direction sometimes. So, but I am always open to suggestions or comments, or um, anything that Anyway, if you guys have any questions, I'm happy to answer any questions. Obviously, I'm not going to give any kind of legal advice on a production I'm not working on, but happy to provide my input. Because like I said, every studio is different, unfortunately. And it's a good thing to maybe I should try to talk to all these different studios and try to get us all on the same page. We did try to do that at one point. I don't think it went over very well. The clearance crew, me and the others, we do have a group of clearance professionals called Clear Inc. And we do meet and we do talk about things, but most of the studio clearance people aren't necessarily in the group. So we don't really get their perspective all the time on it. But, we do talk to them, and we do try to, figure things out to make it more streamlined, for sure. Make everybody's jobs a little bit easier. So. Yeah, JD Salinger will never sign off on Catcher in the Rye. He doesn't ever want that book in movies, but we let that red cover go. Like I said, Michelle Obama doesn't allow her book to be used in anything. I did, Shel Silverstein, The Giving Tree, will never sign off on a movie. It's a lot of authors, I'm trying to think. It's interesting, like on one thing, like I had a TV show that wanted to use a Damien Hirst artwork, and I was told no, Damien Hirst never says yes. And then on another project, Damien Hirst said yes. So you just never know. So I wouldn't never want to have like an across the board, like if you really want something and somebody's saying, oh no, they never give permission, I would say try, because things change and evolve. And especially like oftentimes, if like the artist when they were living will not give you permission, once they die, sometimes the estate wants to make money, and so they'll say yes, or vice versa, especially like film clips. I have that situation where estates tend to want to give you permission because they want money, but they don't want to take SAG scale. They'll want more money. So depending on how important, you'll pay, right?
Yeah.
That's insane. I will say, since COVID, it's been really hard to get answers from companies, and it's almost impossible to get anybody on a phone anymore, because most people are working from home even still. And so COVID hasn't helped us in the respect of getting permission necessarily. Like it's kind of a bummer. You can email people. Basically, the take we have is that if you don't get a reply, that's a no. So, and we just need to move on. I would never wait 3 years, that's for sure. Had situations where, we'll go to a company and if something is super, super important to production, I've gotten it where we've gotten like you can proceed, we're not going to sign your release. And sometimes legal teams will accept that,
Mhm.
so if you got that kind of an email, I would definitely talk to legal and your clearance people and say, hey, listen, they're not going to sign a release, but we got this. Is it something that, we can proceed with or not? And I
Right.
have had some legal teams saying, yes, just put that in the file and proceed. Because, these studio agreements, I'll be honest, are really intimidating to leak some of these companies.
Right.
And so they don't really understand what they're signing to protect them as well. I try to explain what each provision really means so that they
Mm.
understand it. But if they want to talk to their lawyers and that costs money. So uh, anyway, it's just something to just kind of be transparent with your clearance and legal team on, and hopefully maybe they'll let it go. You just never know. I mean, I will say Mattel, I think Mattel asks for Mattel and HarperCollins, they both ask for 16 to 20 weeks for an answer. And we all know we don't have 16 to 20 weeks generally to wait for an answer. So I would say those two companies are really, really difficult to deal with. Hasbro, they used to have a permissions department, and then they laid the woman off who was working there for years and years. Hasbro is like you can get it. It may take a couple weeks to get, but they are more film friendly, I would say, than Mattel for sure. Depending on how important a project is. And as the clearance coordinator, you really need to stay on top of these companies. Like I worked on A Christmas Story, the most recent one that was out a couple years ago, and I really had to stay on top of Mattel. Like I was like, this is a perfect opportunity for you to highlight your games in. Like it's a family film. So they usually generally for a family film will want to participate. And so I did end up getting the answer. But if you're working on a horror film and you're going for Mattel, I would probably just tell production to find something else. And Disney too. Disney, that's where I came from. And Disney generally doesn't want their animated characters to be used in any non-family type fare. So I just had a situation where I was trying to license a clip from Disney, and they ended up giving us permission, but it did have some underage drinking, and they did not like that, and they asked us if we could change that. So oftentimes, you have to go when you go to a company and they do want to have some sort of creative control. So, we don't always want to give up that creative control to a company to tell you the direction of your script. So that's something that you should definitely talk about before you go. That same thing is for with some sport entities. In the olden days, we used to go and clear all the sport entities and get their permission. And now I would say a good amount of productions will allow you to use a sports jersey on a character as long as nothing bad is happening, or have a character wearing a hat as long as nothing bad is happening. And so we have gotten a little bit, we've gotten definitely more relaxed on that kind of stuff. So, well, a mugshot taken by the government should be in the public domain. The issue about this, again, is where you're pulling it from. So, Alame might have it. I would probably let you license it from Alame, but you'd
Mhm.
have to go on a government site and find the image rather than, some other site. But that's the issue with a photo is where you're grabbing it from. And when you grab it, you're agreeing to those terms and conditions, which may not be film friendly. So that would be the important thing that we would want to know is where you're pulling it from. You know, are you making fun of him? Are you, what kind of commentary is being said about it? Those are kind of important aspects of how we would want to know so that we can assess the issue on using it. Yeah, that's a really good question because a lot of times production, like for instance, I'm working on this production and they submitted an ice maker. Well, normally an ice maker, I wouldn't care. Well, they just submitted it. They said, here, we want to use this. And I was like, well, how's it being used? Oh, we're putting dead body parts in the ice maker. Yeah, no, really important that you guys are super transparent on the use. So, I would just say when you submit the item, let us know how it's being used. you know, I read every script, but I read a lot of different scripts. So I don't always remember the exact use on a certain item. So I do think it's important to just remind us sometimes on how something is being used, for sure. Long time. I will tell you, I worked on a production. I'm telling you, like, I would hold on to them as long as you can. This had never happened to me before, but I worked on a production. And then, you know, it came out, the movie came out, and then it went dormant for years. It was an independent film, went dormant. Then we got a claim because the movie was debuting on Netflix. And we got a claim, I think it was 10 years after that movie was made. And we got a claim. And that was back in the days where everything wasn't digital, like it wasn't online for me. Like you know, now I started scanning everything and now everything is scanned in. But I had to go back to my books, and it did take me a long time to find it, but I did find the signed release eventually and had to submit that. But I would not recommend you get rid of your files anytime soon. You should see my garage. I have files upon files upon files because I don't want to throw anything away because something could come back. You know, when a movie goes dormant and it doesn't, the statute of limitations is a certain amount of years. However, I learned on this production that since it went dormant, and then once they got picked up by Netflix, that statute of limitations started up again. So, you know, so I would say, I would highly advise you to hold on to your records. Now, if any of you have worked with me, you know I keep status reports. I think it's super important. I know there's clearance people out there that don't keep status reports. The status report, honestly, is helps me tremendously when I go and watch the film, you know, 9 months after the job or 12, you know, who knows how long. I don't know how people remember everything they clear. You know, we work on multiple projects at the same time, and it's very hard to keep track of. So I think status reports are really important. So if you guys are keeping your own because the clearance coordinator is not, I would certainly distribute that to the post department so they're aware of it as well. You know, definitely have post involved in your paperwork. And if there is a clearance person, I would definitely send it to them as well, just so they have a record of it as well.